Hey there, true crime fans. Welcome back to For Criming Out Loud and our Crime Me to Sleep Bedtime series. This is episode 5 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. So if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and go into the playlist to start the book from the beginning. Let's get into episode 5 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. The Golden Years. Axel Johansson was a merchant seaman of Swedish descent who was looking to put down roots in San Francisco and make a life for himself on land. He brought in a respectable wage for his work at sea, and he was rarely around to see how that money might be spent. Dorothea's ideal man. Their courtship was relatively long by the woman's standards. With Axel being called back to duty so regularly, she barely had the time to get her hooks into him before he vanished once again. Still, he came looking for her each time he made dock, excited to hear more of her stories and to learn of the dramas of her life that he was so envious of. Dorothea's lies had not stopped for even a moment throughout the years. She wasn't going to share her criminal history with this man while she was still trying to snare him, so she had come up with some sort of job for herself to explain away her survival. He lapped up the stories of her youth in Mexico and was silenced with sorrow by the tale of her brave soldier husband struck down in his prime. It was reasonable then to assume that he would swallow whatever fresh peck of lies she offered him, hook, line, and sinker. Her story was straight until 1948, when her husband died. So it was there in that she laid the groundwork for the rest of her invented past. In a department store named the Emporium in San Francisco, the 19-year-old Dorothea had been approached by a strange man who sized her up. Hardly an uncommon occurrence for her in those days. But instead of asking her out on a date, this man had pressed his card into her hands. He was a talent scout for the Radio City Rockettes, the famous New York City dance troupe, and he wanted her to join them. Despite having no training in dance, she had taken fate by the horns and jumped on the first flight out east to compete in auditions. And, wouldn't you know it, her natural grace and talent had been enough to get her through. She was a rockette. Even still, she wasn't ready to abandon her career in San Francisco, working as the chef in one of the town's top seafood restaurants. She would commute back and forth, working Thursday to Sunday on the stages of New York as Sharon Nayarda, then flying back to run her award-winning kitchen for the rest of the time. The seafood aspect was clearly tailored to her assumptions about what sailors might enjoy eating, and having had a few of Dorothea's home-cooked meals by this point in their relationship, Axel could easily believe that the woman was capable of being a chef. On top of all the other momentous events in her life, some of the details that she used to embroider her life story seemed a little preposterous, but she told the stories with such surety and fervor that it was impossible to doubt her. Her career as a rockette was brought to a tragic end only shortly before she met Axel, although the date tended to drift slightly in later retellings. Dancing on the stage in front of another full house, Dorothea had been the unfortunate victim of a random chance once more. The girl dancing beside her snapped one of her high heels, stumbled into Dorothea, and knocked the pair of them into the orchestra pit. While Dorothea escaped the accident with nothing but a broken leg and an ended career, she delighted in furnishing Axel with all of the horrid details of the fate of the other dancer, who was left paralyzed by the accident. Insult was added to injury when she was abandoned to rot in some hospital, soaking in her own urine, while her husband ran off with another rocket. Axel took all of this at face value, taking care never to mention dancing in front of Dorothea in case it hurt her feelings, and proposed to her soon after being introduced to the vast overlapping melodramas that composed her life. Her energy was infectious, even if it came from a place of nervous deception rather than animal magnetism, but that energy in itself was enough to draw him further in. Most of the women he met were put off by his coarse manners and gruff appearance. To find one that seemed not only genuinely interested in him, but also fascinating in her own right, was a big boost to his bruised ego. Once they were married, in a far more elaborate ceremony than was really required for the incredibly small wedding party, Axel and Dorothea settled into the home on the edge of what would one day become suburbia. As with her first husband, Dorothea lavished her attentions, both culinary and sexual, on Axel, making sure, before he went off to sea for the first time as a married man, that he would not stray. Left alone in the house for weeks at a time, Dorothea should have been in heaven. This is exactly what she wanted: peace and the money to do whatever she wanted with that peace. But still, that same burning wanderlust seemed to take over her whenever she sat still for too long. Born into chaos, she would always be restless. In those early days, she drank more than she ate, spending as much time in a drunken haze as she could afford, and her lack of attention soon became apparent by the state of her home. It slid into disrepair rapidly, and with Dorothea fully intending to give it one solid tidy before Axel came home from sea, she lost track of the days as she slumped further into alcoholism, and Axel came home to a wreck of a house and a wife passed out in their marriage bed. In those days, domestic abuse was not spoken about. If a woman's husband had to strike her to reinforce a lesson that he was trying to convey, then the shame was conveyed not onto the violent man, but onto the woman for failing to complete her duties how they should have been. The war changed many things, and women's liberation movements were on the rise by the 50s. But the presiding view was still that a wife was a subject of her husband, not his equal. She was beaten soundly for her slovenly behavior, for her drunkenness, and for the poor welcome that she offered her husband. The punitive measures seemed to work. She immediately cleaned up her act. By the time that the bruises had faded, their home was as pristine as the day he had first set sail. There was a delicious meal on the table each night, and their evenings were spent in intense conversation. More and more ridiculous details were added to Dorothea's stories on those evenings. She regaled Axel with stories about her time with the Rockettes and the star-studded lifestyle that she had led before abandoning it all to settle down with him. John Kennedy, the future president, was appearing more and more often in the news, so he and his wife Jackie were woven into her tales. The actress Rita Hayworth was cast as Dorothea's best friend, and she could spend hours spinning tales about their times together in New York, mostly harvested from the gossip columns of newspapers. The longer that Axel spent in her company, the more he seemed to grow tired of her, and the more extravagant her inventions became. Eventually, she began tripping over her own stories, trying to keep him enthralled with the image of her as a glamorous creature, but the more that she pushed the limits of credulity, the more he withdrew from her. He dreaded what he would find if he went back out to sea again and delayed returning to work for as long as he could. But as their savings dwindled, he was forced to leave Dorothea behind once more. Once again, the same pattern repeated: boredom, liquor, and gradual decline. Dorothea started trawling bars for the attention that she felt she lacked at home, and she found it in spades. Her body had thickened over the years, but she still knew just how to dress to emphasize her best assets, and the stories that she had made her husband so confused with were lapped up by the men that she pressed up against in bars. Over the years that followed, Dorothea would often bring men home and sleep with them in her marriage bed. Taxis would appear late in the evening, delivering strange men to her parlor. The neighbors never accused her outright of prostitution or anything so coarse, but they did see to it that news of her infidelity made it back to Axel when he came back into town. The beatings grew in their regularity over the years of their marriage, but even at her most bruised and battered, Dorothea never blamed her husband for his actions. She was the one who was creating the problem. He was merely trying to correct it. Over and over through their marriage, this same pattern repeated. Dorothea's stories became more extravagant, her behavior more erratic. When asked by the neighbors about her life before moving to San Francisco, she would tell a garbled mixture of the tales that she had made up for Axel and new ones that she had created for the men in bars, alcohol muddling her memory and ability to keep her stories straight. Some of them she told about her career in the Rockettes, but while half of them heard about her tragic fall into the orchestra pit, the others heard about how Rita Hayworth had taken her back to Hollywood and made her a star in the pictures. When asked what roles she had played, she would reply, "The evil woman," a starring role in dozens of pictures that nobody had ever heard of. The strangest and most ominous, perhaps, story that she had told anyone who might ask was about her current career. She claimed to be a holistic doctor. Visitors to her home couldn't deny that she had an interest in medicine. There was a plethora of drug bottles about, and books documenting the effects of different medicines were left scattered over every surface. Many people in the neighborhood would come to her for advice when they took ill as a result, and she soon found herself being drawn into the community almost against her will. For a time, Axel took this as a good sign, a sign that his wife was finally setting into a normal life with friends and ties to the community. But as her obsession progressed and she began prescribing treatments and medicines to people, often furnishing them with drugs that she had acquired herself, he became increasingly nervous. Even in her wildest fantasies, Dorothea had never mentioned any time spent in medical school, and he became more and more convinced that she was going to kill someone with the pills she was handing out like candy. When he tried to confront her about it, Dorothea switched her story yet again, talking about the medical training that she had received back in Mexico and how she had traveled around remote villages dispensing medicine alongside her beloved mother. It was the last straw for Axel. Before, he had been able to discount Dorothea's conflicting stories as mistakes or failings of memory, but this was a wholesale rewriting of history. It made him realize just how little he knew about his wife and how much trust he had put into her word. Before the situation could escalate further, he took what he considered to be the necessary steps to ensure Dorothea and the neighborhood's safety. In 1961, he had her committed. Dorothea did not have a pleasant stay in the San Francisco Marine Hospital. There was no distinction between the criminally insane and the members of the public who were currently undergoing a crisis. The hospital was also shared with 6 sailors carrying all manner of horrific diseases from around the world. The administration of the hospital also left a lot to be desired, and it was only when Axel directly intervened on her behalf that Dorothea was taken off of a schedule to be surgically sterilized in the eugenics program that was still in operation there. For their part, the doctors found Dorothea, with her constantly changing stories and her pleas for sympathy, to be a very confusing patient. Mental health care was still in its infancies in the 50s, and Dorothea's prognosis today would have been wildly different, as well as her diagnosis. Narcissism and psychopathy were both recognized as symptoms rather than as underlying conditions in themselves. So Dorothea's manipulative stories and utter lack of empathy were taken to be the result of undifferentiated schizophrenia. They believed that she couldn't distinguish between her realistic hallucinations and real events, and this is what was causing her to have no emotional attachment to those around her. She was ordered to give up alcohol, which was thought to exacerbate the symptoms of schizophrenia, and then handed back to her husband into his tender, loving care. Axel didn't know what to do with her. He couldn't stay at home and watch her every hour of the day. He had to go to sea for weeks or months at a time. And even with his presence, Dorothea seemed reluctant to change. She had considered all of his previous punishments to be just, a fair response to her failings as a wife, but she didn't take kindly to her confinement in the state mental hospital. The void between them grew wider and wider with each passing day. Dorothea was kept sequestered in their home. Her only contact with the world outside was Axel, and even he was reluctant to speak to her most of the time. The stigma attached to mental illness now is nothing compared to the shame connected with it in the 60s. Axel had taken pains to ensure that nobody knew where Dorothea had gone when she was in the hospital, implying that she was visiting with relatives. But now that she was back home, he found it difficult to continue manufacturing excuses. Eventually, the time came for him to return to work, and so, given no other option, he handed Dorothea back her freedom and walked away. Throughout the entire journey, he dreaded what he would come back to and what fresh chaos Dorothea might have invited into his house. There had been times when he was certain that she had a man staying with her, other times when it seemed she had thrown a big, raucous party. Who knew what she might do now? He spent his whole time at sea consumed with dread and rushed home the moment that he got into port. As it turned out, he shouldn't have worried. The place was spotlessly clean, meticulously organized, and carefully locked up. The only thing that was missing was his wife. She had vanished without a trace. Thank you for listening to episode 5 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. If you're enjoying this true crime series so far, please hit the like button and remember to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Until then, good night.